I assume that all of you are here because you have heard that Joanne and I, or read that Joanne and I are planning to go to China. She'll already be there because she lives there. I'm going to go in March. And we're going to be visiting places, traveling some of the ways that Esther Nelson traveled. Esther was a missionary from Bethlehem, which was First Swedish Baptist Church at the time. She left in 1924, and her time in China ended in 1951. So I just want to start out by putting Esther a little bit into historical context. Adoniram Judson was the very first missionary who left America to go overseas as a missionary. So he's considered the beginning, the first in the American missionary movement. That was in 1812. So Esther went in 1924. That's, you figure it out, a little over 100 years. But, so that was 1812. 1871, 60 years after him, was the beginning of First Swedish Baptist Church, our church. There were 22 charter members at the beginning, and then it grew really rapidly. But anyways, 1871, there are certain landmark things in history, and for 1871, I'm thinking that's just 6 years after the Civil War ended, which didn't touch Minnesota a whole lot, but there were people who went, and it was a very decisive event in our country's history. Okay, and Adoniram Judson had gone just a few years after the birth of our country. So then I read that in 1881 through 91, 12 people were sent as missionaries from First Swedish Baptist Church. It's going to take more research for me to find out who they were and where they were going. And I also don't know whether they were home missionaries or foreign missionaries, because that wasn't always a distinction that was made. But in any case, Bethlehem, from near its beginning, was thinking about sending people and doing it. 1890, Ola and Minnie Hansen went to Burma, which was also where Adoniram Judson had gone. And that's quite a story that's related to First Swedish Baptist Church, Bethlehem, which I'm not going to tell tonight, but you can find it on the Bethlehem website if you go look for it. I don't know how many others there were between the Hansens in 1890 and Esther in 1924, because obviously First Swedish Baptist Church was thinking about missions. But as far as I can tell, Esther was the first one from our church to go to China. And I'll do more research to figure that out before I say it flat out. But she sends very newsy letters back here to Bethlehem to her friend Elsie Byron, who was working at the church, and that's how we have the letters, because Elsie here saved them. And in her newsy letters, she would talk about people that they both knew who were somewhere else in China, or she'd ask about how the Hansens were doing in Burma, or Felita and Franklin Nelson, who were going to be going to Burma much later in her time in China. Anyway, she never mentioned anybody from Bethlehem who was also working in China. So I deduced from that she was the first for sure, and maybe the only one during the time that she was there. So I've just told you some years. I was going to write them down, but I'll just tell them to you. 1812, Adoniram Judson. 1871, First Swedish Baptist Church. 1890, Ola and Minnie Hansen. And then 1924, Esther Nelson. That's the beginning of our Bethlehem's, which was First Swedish Baptist Church at the time, connection with China. And so to put that in bigger historical perspective, that's 60 years after the Civil War, just 6 years after the end of World War I. So one of the reasons I'm really glad had to be thinking about talking to you tonight is that I feel like I learned a lot more about Esther just in the last few days. Things that I really already knew, but they took on a new light. Because in her letters, she's self-deprecating is a word I keep using for her. She just sort of plays down who she is and what she does, just sort of a farm girl from somewhere in Minnesota who came to Minneapolis to get her nurses training. But what I'm seeing here is something really much more than that. What kind of a woman travels alone to the other side of the world at a time when the world is really still in turmoil? The war might have ended, but it was really just sort of an interval until World War II started. So, and China, which at that time had sort of its own history, was 24 years or so before she went in 1924 was when the Boxer Rebellion happened, and in certain parts of China they were killing foreigners right and left, especially missionaries. And so she heads off to China, and not just to the Shanghai or one of the coastal cities where there are a fair number of Westerners, non-Chinese people who are living, but far inland to Sichuan. Joanne's going to show you some maps and give you that perspective when she's here. So China was really a fairly mysterious place to just the normal American person at that time. She almost certainly knows other missionaries from Bethlehem, but I don't know how many. Our denomination, which was the first Swedish Baptist General Conference at that time, had no mission board. So the Olahansons, Esther, others who were part of the Swedish Baptist Conference went with the American Baptist Foreign Mission Society. So that's who she was with for most of her time. So she's not even going with sort of brother and sister missionaries from her own denomination. So when she arrives in 1924, it's 20 years after the Boxer Rebellion, but it's also at the end of the thousands of years of one dynasty after another of emperors, and so China doesn't even really know who China is right now. And there were warlords all around the country. Joanne will get up and tell you if I'm saying anything wrong here. But who were basically competing with each other, which means war, battles, to get the most territory. So when she first arrives, her letters home are about the general in the next town, or things are kind of rough in our town today, or it was really changing in and out. You never knew what it was going to be one day. That's the China that she went to. During the course of her 25 years in China, she had to evacuate 3 or 4 times. Some, in 1945, when it was the World War II time, or somewhere right around 1945, she actually came back to the States, but sometimes she would just evacuate from where she was in Sichuan out to Shanghai, she and the missionaries in her town, so it wasn't always leaving the country. So, she goes through really, if you think about it historically, fast-moving times in China. Warlords battling, Japanese invasion, anti-foreign threats and dangers that popped up again, even after the Boxer Rebellions farther in the past. Mao's Long March went within miles of where she was working in a hospital, and they were dealing with injuries from that and from other times of fighting in the hills nearby. Japanese bombings during World War II, civil war between the nationalists and the communists, and then finally the communist liberation of China. When she went, the only time she ever flew across the ocean, across the Pacific Ocean, was when she was leaving the last time in 1951, and that was an emergency sort of situation. So otherwise, she was going by ship, and it took 3 to almost 4 months between Minneapolis and Sichuan. So, you're not, add in that she's not making neat connections between your flight lands now and you have a 3-hour layover, or maybe you have a 7-hour layover and you're complaining about it. She might have to wait a few days till the ship, or weeks even, until the ship even goes. But, or not the ship, but the other smaller transportations later. So, train, ocean liner, river steamer, river raft, rickshaw, mule, wheelbarrow. If you can think of anything that moves, she probably used it as transportation sometime. So, think of the determination it took to just get there. And that's before she even started her real work. So, that's a kind of woman I want to know more about.